Good evening and welcome to our first EACLIPT webinar on what is the common ground for modern psychotherapy. My name is Dr. Marta Jackowska. I work at SWPS University in Poland, which is a co-organizer of these webinars. Today, I will be your host. EACLIPT webinars have been established first to share and propagate new knowledge and evidence from the field of clinical psychology, and second, to create a platform that will not only promote EACLIPT, but also to provide us with space for all of us who are interested in clinical psychology and its treatment. On behalf of EACLIPT and SWPS University, I want to extend our gratitude and thanks to Professor Stefan Hoffmann, who will be our keynote lecture speaker, as well as to our discussion panelists, who include, again, Professor Hoffmann, as well as Professor Jacques Barber, Professor Bruce Wampold, and Professor Paul Salkovskis. Now I would like to give the floor to Professor Claudie Bochting, who is the president of EACLIPT and will say a few words about this organization. And then we will hear from Professor Winfried Reef, who is also from the EACLIPT organization. And importantly, he is the chief editor of EACLIPT Journal, Clinical Psychology in Europe. Last but not least, I wish to thank all of our audience who came here in large number, and please use the chat function to ask questions that we will try as best as we can to answer. Thank you for listening. Claudie, please to you.
Yes, welcome everyone. We are very excited that you are able to join us. Probably you had a long day with either clinical work, research, or the combination of both. Probably you're also facing part of another partly locked down because of COVID, and still you find it important enough to listen to this webinar. And just Marta announced our association in a very quick way, and then it's very convincing, because then I think, oh, it is really existing, the EACLIPT. But what is it? So it's the European Association of Clinical Psychology and Psychological Treatment. And it has many aims, but one of them is actually the representation of clinical psychologists on a European level, for instance, when it comes to research money, but also when it comes to policy, or even making sure on a European level that people who are suffering endlessly because of mental health problems get the right type of evidence-based treatment. So we have a lot to do to be able to represent us all. And because of that, we are really excited that especially the top of our field in clinical psychology are taking their time to give Stefan Hoffmann to give a keynote, but also with the top of the field to do a discussion on the common grounds of psychotherapy. And that is indeed one of the aspects of clinical psychology, but I think many of us share it's a very important one. This is a free webinar. We really like that, and we also would like to thank also the university for in Poland to actually enable us. But we also would like to support you and seduce you to come again at our next webinars, and maybe also to become a member. So for us to make it more important, but also more feasible to represent all of you. I promise to only talk really little because we want to go to the content, and I really would like to, I hope that you have a very interesting webinar and that you come up with all these chats so that we make it really hard for this top researchers in clinical psychology. Marta, I give the word back to you.
Can we now have Professor Winfried Reef to introduce Professor Hoffmann, please? And thank you.
Good evening to everybody. It's my great pleasure to introduce Stefan Hoffmann and to say a few words about him. Stefan graduated at the University of Marburg in Germany, and eventually he moved to Tom Roth Lab in Stanford, and afterwards to David Barlow's lab in Albany, New York State. In 1996, he moved to Boston, and since then he published major contributions to our field. Just to mention a few of them, the pharmacological augmentation of psychotherapy and further contribution to translational research. In 2021, he got the most prestigious German research award, Alexander von Humboldt Award, which provided him good platform. I think it's even an excellent platform to continue his work in Germany. And he also got some additional support from the state of Hessen's ministry top professorship programs. Today he will talk about process-based psychotherapy, a concept that he developed together with Steve Hayes. And I think this is a great introduction also for a second part, because maybe we can discuss whether process-based psychotherapy is also a common framework, a good common framework for psychotherapy in general. Stefan, I'm really happy and proud that you are our first official speaker in this series of webinars, and thank you for agreeing to contribute. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Winfried. Thank you, Claudi. Thank you, Marta. It's a pleasure being here. I'm quite honored, and I'm very curious about the reception of this presentation. So I'm going to present on process-based therapy. I hope you can all see my slides. A brief disclosure. Let me start out with giving you a brief summary of what I'm going to discuss. First, I'm going to describe this ongoing transition that moves away from a simple nomothetic approach where we group people into more or less very heterogeneous groups based on a syndrome idea toward that is based on a latent disease model, toward an idiographic approach that is much more theory-based and that we would call process-based. I'm going to show you how this transition can be done practically, clinically, practically, and how we can do this and targeting these change processes that we'll be discussing. And I think there are lots of implications of this approach. One important one being that that we can get rid of these unnecessary divides, schools, and can broaden generally the range of methods that are available to study evidence-based therapy. So I would call it nothing less than a paradigm shift if we are moving this way. I think many of you will agree with me that we have problems in psychology. Some of you will agree with me that we might even call it a crisis. What is this crisis in psychology and also the crisis in psychiatry? I think 3 points are worth mentioning. One is we are very focused on syndromes, and we've been developing very specific treatment protocols for syndromes, for DSM and ICD-defined disorders. As a result, we have been paying less and less attention to the individual, even though in clinical practice that's what we do. But in research, we're moving away from it. We are too mechanistic. We're focusing too little on treatment change, even though it is popular and modern to study mediation. I believe the way we've been studying processes in mediation is insufficient and greatly deficient. I believe process-based therapy is a solution to this. It is not a new therapy. It is rather a way of combining what we know works for an individual client in the best possible way. What is the core problem of all of this, of all of these different crises that I just outlined? I think the core problem is really this: the ICD and the DSM, and they have been obviously great. They have provided us with a lot of fertile grounds to study various psychological, psychiatric problems, and have enabled us to clarify some of these issues. Yet they are based on some very simplistic and perhaps even wrong ideas. As a result, CBT started out as a broad general approach of studying mental disorders. There was just one CBT. Tim Beck and Al Ellis did not develop different CBT types. There was one CBT. I was trained by Tim in CBT, and you adopted it to your clients. But throughout this process of developing the ICD and the DSM, we provided very effective alternatives to drug treatments. And as a result, we turned them into highly specific protocols. There's this just a snapshot of a very long list of all sorts of different treatment protocols. Oops, I'm sorry. I think I missed here for a second my slides. Different treatments such as acceptance commitment therapy for depression, and some of you might argue that's not really CBT, but we have CBT protocols for bulimia, for pain, for eating disorders, etc. It's a long list. This is not for you to read it, but we are filling easily libraries with these treatment protocols, and many people make their careers developing those kind of approaches. And obviously, there are many publishers who love these kind of ideas. At the same time, though, we have a fairly limited list of actual strategies that we are using in our treatments. These are behavioral and cognitive strategies targeting cognitive biases, targeting behavioral issues, targeting motivation. This is probably not a complete list, but it is a fairly complete list that has been derived not by us, but by an interorganizational task force that was convened a number of years ago, asking clinicians, scholars getting together and asking a simple question: what should our clinicians, what should our students, also more importantly, what should our students know? What kind of strategies should every good clinician know in order to treat any person who comes into her or his practice? Well, this is the list. You will probably agree with pretty much all of them, and there might be issues that are missing, but not a whole lot. There are cognitive strategies, again, problem-solving, exposure, behavioral activation, interpersonal skills, modifying core beliefs, cognitive diffusion, cognitive reappraisal, attention training, etc. List of 12, 13 such strategies. It is obviously in clinical practice, you're trying to figure out how to put these components, these competencies, these strategies in best use for a given client, similar to bricks that you put together to form any structure you want to build. You can build bridges, buildings, and anything you want. The bricks are these basic elements, and these are the strategies, are those basic elements of those approaches. There's no need to classify these structures into anything other than what you're building with these bricks. Another underlying serious problem that we have, which is closely associated with what I've been talking about, is this latent disease model that we are operating with. The ICD and the DSM assumes that we cannot measure and test and quantify the disorder directly. There's no test to measure depression, really, or to measure generalized anxiety disorder, etc. We induce the existence of that by asking people questions, and we believe that these reports are expressions of those symptoms that people have, of expressions of those latent diseases expressed in the form of those symptoms. So we replace this disease idea with a word called generalized anxiety disorder or major depressive disorder. And there have been, over the course of the development of the DSM-5, and I was part of as an advisor, so I got a bit of an inside knowledge into this process. There have been very controversial discussions were going on between back then the the director of the National Institute of Mental Health, Tom Insel, and David Kupfer and others, who thought the controversy surrounded that the DSM-5 was not a real innovation toward the DSM-4, but rather just a little bit more of the same. And so Insel and others proposed a completely different idea, this RDoC, Research Domain Criteria, that links these symptoms to specific circuitries, genes, other biological markers. Again, the general idea was to identify the real cause of this thing that some of us call depression, generalized anxiety disorder. A completely different approach, and this is where the paradigm shift might come in, is perhaps there is no such thing as a latent disease. Maybe it doesn't exist, and maybe even if it exists, as a clinician, we really don't care if it exists. What if we do as if the disease idea doesn't exist? And as a clinician, you really are interested in how these symptoms interrelate, the so-called symptoms, those problems. Let's call them problems. It's a better term than symptoms, because symptoms implies it's a reflection of a disease. So as an example, a person with GAD worries and has sleep problems, and a person with depression also has sleep problems, and they might feel bad about themselves. Some of them, not everybody. Whereas out of a group of some 3,000 depressed patients, you see about 1,000 different combinations of those symptom combinations. You have a lot of subgroups within the category depression. What's important, though, is that these problems interrelate, that perhaps the sleep problems might actually be causally linked to the worrying. Perhaps because the person is worrying, they might have sleep problems. And by targeting the worrying, you might also target the sleeping. And as a good clinician, you look at this functionality between these issues. That is the basic approach of process-based therapy. Yet we are not really targeting this in the way we've been doing so-called mechanism research, so-called mediation research. We've been blinded by Barron and Kinney, who published in 1986 a very highly influential paper that basically introduced the idea of mediation and moderation as a different variable affecting the relationship between two variables. A mediator is thought to explain the relationship that exists between variable 1 and 2, in this case, between treatment and outcome. So in other words, a treatment works in the clinical field, we believe a treatment works because it changes the mediator, which then changes the outcome. So this is a basic mediation model. And looking at that, we've all been trained, and it has been drilled into our heads that this is the way we should do therapy research. And yes, there are now newer technologies and methods to do that, but basically it's the same idea. Mediator, it should precede the outcome, and it should be a unidirectional relationship. And often when we look at this in studies, we look at one, maybe two mediators, not a whole lot more. Now, who really believes that treatment is caused by changing one single variable? Why would you assume that this is a unidirectional relationship, that whatever happens as an outcome cannot change back to the mediator? Why would you assume that they are not a complex, that many other variables are also influencing this relationship? And most importantly, I will summarize it again. Why would we look at groups of individuals and assume just because this is true for the group, it's also true for the individuals of this group? So meaning that we make this easy jump from going from nomothetic to idiographic. And that's a big problem. Let me illustrate that for you. So here's a typical mediation relationship. A person had a breakup. They ruminate, and it results in low mood. And if you were to do studies, you might find in a group of students, in fact, rumination is a partial mediator, and you're happy and publish that in one of our journals. maybe our clinical psychology journal, and maybe Winfried even accepts it. Now, but this is the problem here. Therapy mechanism is not due to one or a few variables. Therapy is a highly complex process. Variables in therapy rarely only form linear relationships. They usually form bidirectional relationships, and they are rarely linear. They are complex. That goes up and down. And again, as I mentioned already, the biggest problem, I think, is we're using normothetic data to make assumptions, to conclude what's true for the individual. If it's nothing wrong with studying groups, but group data tell us what's true for the group. In order to study the individual, in order to make assumptions about the individual, we need to study the individual. Going back from this slide, this picture, to something that might be more realistic. It's certainly possible that rumination is a relevant factor in one particular individual, and perhaps even a unidirectional link to depression or low mood. But perhaps this person has other issues that are much more central to the person's problems. Perhaps the person feels lonely, and maybe there's low self-esteem that contributes bidirectionally to low mood. And maybe loneliness and loneliness and low self-esteem also form a bidirectional relationship. As a result, targeting rumination in this particular individual will not result in much of an outcome. It will reduce the problem to some extent, certainly, but in order to be most effective, you might want to, in this case, in this particular individual, target loneliness and low self-esteem. Especially the low self-esteem in this case is most central to this person's problem. So, to summarize what I just said, and I'm going to say more, obviously, I'm not done yet, but for now, therapy is not a linear, unidirectional, posivariate mechanism. Posivariate meaning only a few variables involved. Instead, therapy is typically a highly complex process that involves a multitude of variables that typically form dynamic processes. And now we're getting to the question, how do we study that? We are not the only ones dealing with complex phenomena. Many of our neighboring science fields are tackling very similar issues, and they've been embracing complex networks. And in fact, we are, as humans, form complex networks, but we are also existing of a complex network. Every single human being is a complex network. Complex networks are not at all unique to the social science or psychology or psychiatry, obviously. Climate scientists embrace complex network analysis in order to make predictions. And you've heard of the term tipping point very often now, recently, in the climate debate. This is exactly what is meant and what we also mean by when we talk about tipping points in psychiatry or clinical psychology. The economic market, stock market or financial markets follow complex network, dynamic network systems, and geneticists embrace complex network analysis in order to understand when actually a protein is being expressed, because some genes turn turn other genes on and off. And obviously the World Wide Web is an example of a complex network. We've been writing on these issues in various outlets. Without being too self-promoting, for those of you who are interested in learning more about that, we started out, as I said, at upper left, with the interorganizational task force on identifying these core competencies, and then we moved quickly into this idea that there are processes that we need to target with, or that we're trying to target with these competencies. And we wrote some in various journals, and most recently our book is going to come out in the next few weeks, called Learning Process-Based Therapy, that gets into the nuts and bolts of the how-to aspect of doing process-based therapy. Again, I'd like to emphasize again, it is not a new form of therapy. It is what we know coming from the CBT tradition, what kind of strategies work really quite well, putting them together in a best possible way, tailored to the individual. What is process-based therapy? So we believe it's a treatment that is based on the coherent application of changeable evidence-based processes linked to evidence-based procedures that ameliorate problems and promote prosperity to people. We really want to go back to our origins in a way. Gordon Paul said in '69 once, we need to understand what treatment by whom is most effective for this individual with that specific problem under which set of circumstances, and how does it come about. This how does it come about targets the idea of processes, of mechanism. Mechanism is not as good as of a word for us, I think, than processes, because it implies this what I just described, the bidirectional nature and dynamic nature of that. So we are expanding this definition, Gordon Paul's definition, and we're asking what are those core biopsychosocial processes that we should target with a given client in order to achieve a given goal. Focus is on change. So change is a sequence of changeable events that lead to good outcome. Now, this I'm quite for good reason I say good outcome and not reducing symptoms, because we do want to target not only what is fixing people up in terms of reducing negative affect, etc., but rather also moving them toward prosperity and toward a greater goal that they might have, and they might not even see it. And good therapists do this. They're trying to move people beyond where their current state. So we want to obviously want to be theoretically sensible. There needs to be grounded in evidence and in science. But we believe these processes are dynamic, they are progressive, they are multi-level, and they are contextually bound. We think of them as empirically established pathways of change. Now, you would say this is very, are we going to throw out the baby with the bathwater? Is it all going to, are we going back to square one? Not at all. And we learned a lot. We learned a great deal from our research, our wonderful randomized controlled trials, and also our laboratory studies examining the various cognitive and behavioral processes. And we asked here, in order to build on what we know, we reviewed the literature. We asked what are actually the most frequently validated mediators in the literature. So we reviewed the literature. We reviewed no fewer than 54,000 studies, plus minus, rated abstracts twice, and we actually went through all of that. And they had to be experimental, longitudinal, human subjects with psychosocial outcome. We ended up with 1,025 studies that were usable to look at what are those mediators in psychology. This is a word cloud that kind of gives you a good impression of what studies looked at. Self-efficacy popped up a lot in our search. Acceptance and mindfulness. And by the way, the cognitive field was also, there are different words that you could subsume under cognition. And by doing so, you would obviously get a very big word called cognition. But you have dysfunctional thoughts, you had behavioral processes and skills, you had so-called diffusion, self-regulation, cognitive reappraisal. All of that is obviously cognitive change. Why am I doing that? Well, can we systematize these mediators in a way that is fair toward different orientations, that are not too single-minded in one particular school that is anchored in only behavior therapy, only cognitive therapy, only ACT, etc.? Is there a way to build a very broad tent, a very broad framework to systematize these mediators? We think there is. And now, before you turn off your laptop and say, okay, I heard enough. This is nonsense. But hear me out. Hear me out. Psychology has a lot to do with evolutionary science, much more so than you think. And no, it's not social Darwinism. It has nothing to do with us. In psychotherapy, our goal is to find a way for a person to become adaptive, to adapt to a given context. Adaptation requires, and these are rules. These are just as natural laws as Newton came up with natural laws. Adaptation requires context-dependent variation, selection, and retention. Variation, selection, and retention in a given context determines adaptation. If there are problems in variation and or selection and or retention, or you apply it in a wrong context, in a context that doesn't fit your needs, then it will result in maladaptation. You have a set of keys and you're trying to open a door. Now, if you pick one random key and try to shove your key into the lock, even though the key doesn't fit, you do not show healthy variation. You need to look for the other key that actually fits. Eventually you find it, you select the right key, you open the door, and you enter. Now you need to somehow retain that. You need to remember, oh, this is the key that fits the door. Now you show healthy retention. Now you come to another door that is also locked. It wouldn't make sense to use the same key again unless the key fits the lock. So you will have to adjust. You will have to adjust to the context. In this case, you show adaptive variation, selection, and retention. Variation, selection, and retention in a given context determines adaptation. These are basic rules. These are not only to explain why species evolve, but they are happening in our daily life. We are in our short-term, long-term goals, we are guided by these very simple principles. And if you're stuck on one particular way of doing it and you don't get where you want to go, you need to show flexibility. And then you need to select what seems to have worked. And then you need to retain it in order to move forward. This is what we would call extended evolutionary metamodel. So here you see the columns: variation, selection, retention in context, and what is it that needs to be what are those different dimensions that we're discussing? Well, they can be obviously behavior, as in my case of the choosing the right key, but it can be affect, it can be cognition, it can be attention, self, motivation, overt behavior, physiological and social cultural. These rows can be, you might add some. We borrowed them from our doc that we convened experts to figure out what are the different systems that might show problems. And there is an affect system, a cognitive system, an attentional system, etc. I think this is a fairly meaningful way of classifying it. However, you should know that these are not independent issues. Obviously, affect is related to cognition, it's related to attention. But they give us a broad framework to understand where maladaptation might happen in a given individual. This allows us in a nice way to classify all of these mediators that I just described to you based on this literature review. We can fairly clearly move them toward whether it's a cognition, an affect, or attention, self, motivation, etc. Let me give an example of maladaptation in our EAM for, let's say, when cognition show maladaptive features based on variation, selection, retention, context. Well, obviously, worrying rumination is an example where the person is stuck. They are not moving, they're not showing the necessary type of variation. You might jump to conclusions. You select the wrong cognitive approach. This is an example of a adaptation on the level of cognition. Retention is you broaden these negative habits in the case of behavior or schemas, thought processes that then result in negative schemas. And you show limited context sensitivity, that in some context it is quite adaptive what you're doing, in another context it's not. Or in one context it's quite adaptive the way you think, but in another context it's not. Context is really quite critical to understand all of that. Affect, problems with variation might be suppression, experimental avoidance as an example for selection, rigidity of self and discounting positive aspects of self, examples of problems in variation selection of self-related processes, attentional inflexibility, attentional bias toward threat as examples of variation selection on the level of attention. You get the idea. So as I also mentioned, these dimensions that I discussed are not independent, but they're interrelated. And this is now where the nuts and bolts aspects of PBT comes in. We want to make sure that these different dimensions of our broad framework are recognized, how they are interrelated, and here this ties it back to the complex network idea. We developed something called an Ingrid, a grid that makes it clear where these problems lie. There can be attention, cognition, self, affect, behavior, motivation, biophysiological, context, or social cultural. And as I just give you an example of how we worked out one particular case. Not going to get into detail in this case, obviously, but here. This person's central problem seems to be rumination, worrying that that pain that she has never goes away. It's linked to anger problems on the affect dimension. She focuses a lot on the pain as a central node in the attention dimension, and her chronic back pain is an example of a biophysiological dimension. So here we introduced as an example mindfulness as a way to perturbate the system, which has an adaptive influence, meaning it perturbates the system, meaning adaptation toward the desirable goal, no longer being bothered by pain, focusing on rumination, focusing on attention to pain. This is the basic idea. I'm not going to get into detail, but this is the basic idea. We're using a broad framework that widens the lens. As a CBT oriented person, you obviously are very focused and very alert. You're paying close attention toward cognition and behavior, but we also want to examine motivation and social cultural, biophysiological, self-related issues. Regardless of your theoretical orientation, we might actually derive some very similar problem network in a given client. And doing so, there's no need to classify yourself as a CBT therapist or a psychodynamic therapist or an ACT therapist, etc. Therapy here is a way of changing a maladaptive network into an adaptive network. We want to perturbate the system in an individual client. And we also want to create an adaptive network now. We want to insert nodes that lead to self-sustaining of this adaptive network. As we move along, this is an example of a dynamic network. We will encounter those tipping points that I just discussed earlier. A network in dynamic network analyses, people often talk about catastrophic bifurcation. This means that there are two attractor states. The attractor state is number one, this is fairly stable. This is the maladaptive network. And an attractor state number three, that may be the adaptive network. And you need to move this, you need to perturbate the system in such a way that this network is disturbed enough for the ball to move over this tipping point to reach another attractor state. This is fascinating research, and we're not the only ones who are doing that, obviously, because you can now, it opens up the possibility of actually predicting events, predicting psychological events that might happen. Because this ball, as it comes close to number 2, to position number 2, there are things happening in the network that are quantifiable, that actually signal, such as something called a phenomenon called critical slowing, that signal that the tipping point is about to be reached. Imagine the possibilities. You might be able to predict a psychotic break, a suicide attempt, or you might predict that the person is about to recover from whatever they're struggling, etc. So these are, back to the strategies that we've been discussing, these are our basic building blocks that we are using to perturbate the system. In conventional strategies we've been using, we are focusing overly and too much on the DSM and ICD in research. And that also has to some extent confined clinical practice. We focus in CBT greatly on symptoms, on syndromes as well. Over the years, we have achieved a great deal in how we move the field forward. And CBT is obviously the greatest achievement that in psychiatry and mental health ever. I would argue, and this is a move toward greater achievement in a way, and moving away from a simplistic mental disease model that is confined by the latent disease idea. We've been focusing also greatly on negative affect, and I think PBT strategies will allow us to depart from the latent disease model. We embrace an idiographic approach, not only on a clinical level, but also on a research level, that will obviously raise important questions about how to study clinical interventions on a larger scale. It's not to say that RCTs are not meaningful. They absolutely are. But we need to, in order to understand processes and study processes, we will need to have to rethink that and perhaps add certain parts to our RCTs to really understand the processes. It's not enough to simply measure a few variables at various times and then claim that this is the mechanism through which treatments work. That's just not the way we can drive our field forward. We emphasize flexibility. We widen the goals of treatment from merely reducing negative affect toward also positive affect by creating adaptive networks that are self-sustaining. We broaden the lens towards social connectedness, purpose, and even quality of life. I think the implications are broad and wide, and I'm not going to go through that in detail. I'm mindful of my time, but just to briefly, I think this is a wonderful group of people that is now discussing this. I think this will be there's room for everybody, really. There's no orientation that should be excluded. In fact, as long as there's evidence for the strategies that you're using, I think there is room to build on that. Again, this is not a final list. PBT, as we see it, is a process, that moves forward, but I do believe that these evolutionary science principles that I outlined earlier are here to stay. They will provide us with a very adaptive, no pun intended, framework to move toward greater personalization in our field. Thank you very much for your attention.
Professor Hofmann, thank you so much for your fascinating talk. We will now have a panel discussion that will be hosted and moderated by Professor Winfried Reif. I just wish to remind everyone that present here we have Professor Stefan Hofmann, then Professor Paul Salkovskis, Professor Jacques Barber, and then Professor Bruce Wampold. And now over to you, Winfried. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Martha. Before starting this panel discussion, we agreed with the panelists that every single participant will get the opportunity to start with a 2 to 3 minute statement. And I would suggest Jacques Barber that he will start. Jacques is certainly known to many of us for his various studies on psychotherapies, especially psychodynamic and cognitive treatments, but also in the e-health field. So Jacques, what about your opinion about our major topic, searching for the common ground of evidence-based psychotherapies?
I mean, at first I want to tell Stefan that it was a very fascinating lecture. And I thought, I tried to read some of your papers, and I must say that your lecture is so much better than your papers, so much easier to read, so much more comprehensible, and et cetera, et cetera. So that was very helpful to me, because then I can understand better what I've tried to read. So I think I have a lot of agreement with the problems you present about clinical psychology, psychopathology, diagnosis, and stuff like that. I think I completely agree with you, and I'm surprised. In fact, I was kind of surprised to hear that there is a process CBT going on in the world, as you know, it's not always something that was clear to me. However, my main problem at this point is that I really admire this erudition, this knowledge of combining neuroscience and psychology and biology. That's amazing. I don't understand all of it, but that's fine. One of the great things is that I think you really are creating a common language for CBT. So you are doing a process. It's not process-based therapy, but what I see is a process-based CBT. Because I feel that some of the work that we've done is not part of this tradition. It's not been incorporated. I'll just give you a few examples. So I think, for example, listening to somebody well is an incredibly important technique and mechanism in psychotherapy. In fact, I would argue that one of the things that we have never studied, or at least I don't know that somebody has studied that, is this idea that when I hear myself speaking in therapy, I'm learning a lot about myself. And I really begin to realize a lot of things about what's going on. So that's just a few examples of things that comes from a different tradition that are, in my opinion, not included in what you describe. So I will stop here. I think it's a fascinating enterprise. I'm really glad that I was invited to hear it, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Jacques, for this introductory statement. So, Paul, you would be the next. Paul Salkovskis, I think many of us know him for his influential work on CBT and anxiety disorders, OCD, hypochondriasis. And I've seen that just recently you even published a paper on transdiagnostic mechanisms of change.
Indeed. Thank you, Winfried. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's very nice as a British person to be in Europe again, because it's where I would very much like to be. This is where I shout out for Latvia, and I have a Latvian passport. So there we go. I'm really a European, not one of these stupid British people who've left the European Union. Okay, so, well, Stefan, I agree with what you say. But the thing is, I've been agreeing with it for 40 years. And it's rather important, because I don't think the paradigm shift you're talking about is actually a paradigm shift. I think that we've known what you're talking about, process-based therapy, is a weakened restatement of formulation, which is central, in my view, to actually all therapy. I think that these approaches are not disease-specific and never have been. Some American protocols, particularly, there are a range of protocols, particularly in America, which have used disease-specific approaches, but I don't think that's a very good way to go, and never have really. So why do I think formulation is important? Because I think formulation is fundamental. It is the most fundamental mechanism of change. And I think essentially you start from the position that people have psychological problems because they think the situation they're in is more negative than it really is. And what you do in therapy, what all therapists do, I think, is take people who are stuck in a particular way of seeing themselves, their situation, the world, and so on, and allow them to consider and evaluate alternative, less negative ways of viewing all those things. And actually, the process of therapy is the process of helping people work out how the world really works. And it's really important that it's not just about thinking positively or whatever. It's about being flexible in your thinking and try to work out what really goes on. And the fundamental process in therapy, as far as I'm concerned, is a partnership of two experts. That's myself as the therapist, and with some claims to be expert, which, I could exaggerate. But then there's the patient, who is the expert in all things about themselves and their experience and so on. And if those two people work together collaboratively, they have some chance of actually beginning to help the person become less rigid and embrace how the world really works. So, and then there's the whole process, the scientific process. And Stefan, you and I have disagreed previously on the evolutionary nature of this. I kind of see it as sort of internet misinformation approach, really. I think this is not an evolutionary approach. I think the thing that you may have forgotten is that what you're talking about is learning, and that individual organisms learn. And that is one of the other fundamental processes involved in therapy, not evolution. Evolution doesn't apply at the level of the individual, but it does. But what does apply at the level of the individual is learning. And one of the things that we do as therapists, fundamental thing we do, is that we help people to learn different ways of approaching things. And all of the other processes you're talking about, of course, they come in, but I kind of think that we need to be rather careful not to adopt the blind watchmaker approach. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you also for some provocative statements. I think this will give some stimulation to Stefan later on. So Bruce Wampold, I think most of us know him for his really influential work on common factors and leading to the contextual model. Actually, Bruce, when I read your CV, I was surprised to read you studied mathematics before you switched to educational psychology. I'm really impressed about that. So you're welcome to start with your statement.
Thank you, Winfried. I never took a psychology course, actually, at university. So I'm kind of an outsider in a way. So, Paul, I'm glad you framed it in that way, because I see it very similarly. I guess I shouldn't be surprised that I agree with you in your comments. Now, look, we're all kind of senior people in the field. We've seen a lot of things come and go. It is particularly frustrating that we have 500-600 different therapies that have been developed. With some rare exceptions, we don't have any reliable differences among them. So we invent new things, and I have my pet peeves about things that we give new names to, which are really old things. And so I'll use a British example, Paul. Peter Fonagy talks about epistemic trust. If that isn't genuineness in a Rogerian sense, I don't know what is. Okay. Behavioral activation, one of our new treatments for depression. Well, they had to scramble and go back for a basis to it. They went back to, now all of a sudden I'm blocking my colleague at the University of Oregon. I can't think of his name now. But we went back and formed the basis of it. Behavioral activation was talked about Peter Lewinson decades ago. So we invent these new things. The question is what Stefan is talking about is something new, or is it something we've been talking about previously? I think, Stefan, you're right. This idea of experimental psychopathology, we could identify a deficit with every disorder, is dead. And I'm glad to hear you say that, because you and some others have always been advocates for this specific protocol for specific disorders. So I'm very glad to see that coming to an end. But, you know, there's lots of process models about how psychotherapy works. Jerome Frank, where is he in all of this? He talked about many of these things. Saul Garfield, Orlinsky and Howard. These were all kind of generic models. I happen to think I have one that's particularly viable, the contextual model. But where are these things? Are we just putting some kind of process with a new language to it and a new way of looking at it? So I would say, Paul, that I agree with you. There isn't much here that's new in a fundamental sense. I'll say a little bit about the network analysis. Yeah, it's great to kind of see that. The way we apply it in psychology has all kinds of statistical and methodological problems. We're never going to be able to reliably say, here's individual A's network, and therefore we ought to do it in this way. But what you're really talking about when you put that network analysis up there of all the different kinds of processes and which causes which is a case conceptualization. And all psychotherapy is personalized because we make case conceptualizations. CBT has been doing that, focused psychodynamic therapy. This is what personalizes it. And we test it out in therapy by trying different strategies. And when they don't work, we understand a bit better about those processes. So Tracy Eales writes a lot about case conceptualization. And I think that's been a critical thing for a long time. So a couple questions. One, will instituting this result in better outcomes? You know, we've had innovations in psychotherapy. We have new treatments. We have things like routine outcome monitoring, Mike Lambert. The research seems to say marginal benefits in some cases. We do a lot of these innovative things, but we really haven't fundamentally changed the effectiveness of psychotherapy. And Stefan, if you can show that this is going to result in demonstrably better outcomes, I'm all for it however you talk about it. But I doubt that. Okay. Second question, where's the therapist in this? We know that the therapist makes a large difference in the outcomes. There are really effective CBT therapists, and there's less or poor CBT therapists. We know this. The same is true for psychodynamic therapy, every other therapy you can think of. Why do we always talk about treatments and conceptualization of problems and so forth, and forget that we got people delivering the treatment and they make the difference? Okay. Then you had that word map with different words there of strategies that are important. But there's some things missing there. We know a therapeutic alliance, regardless of treatment, is extremely important, yet therapeutic alliance is nowhere in that word map. Same thing could be said of empathy, expectations. I would contend that however we conceptualize the problems, the aspect of therapy is this collaboration that Paul talked about of two people working together towards some common goal, with a lot of different ways to achieve that. So I see Winfried's hand is up, so that must mean I've gone on and on. So thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. You'll have further options to continue, but I think it's more interesting for the audience if you have more like dialogues and trialogues and quadrilogues. So Stefan, you got a lot of questions. I think you must be burning for providing an answer.
I don't think there are a lot of questions. There were more statements from my distinguished colleagues and friends. So thank you for that. I really appreciate your feedback and comments. To be honest, I'm a bit surprised that there is such a strong agreement between particularly Bruce and Paul in that, if I understand you guys correctly, experimental psychopathology is dead. If we could give that, could have that on record, and therapeutic alliance is everything. If I also could have that on record, Paul, would you agree with that?
No, I definitely don't. I mean, the question is, what's in your formulation? And what's in your formulation is very well established. So we know that, for example, safety-seeking behaviors, which are the way I like to think about it, are absolutely crucial. And that's one of the vicious circles that are involved in the formulation, which is explored and developed. There are also developmental issues and so on. I actually think it's not just enough to have a nice person delivering flower fairy therapy to you. I think it's really important that it's empirically grounded. So my view is that empirical grounding is absolutely crucial. And I think Bruce and I would be in agreement with that on things like therapeutic alliance. We also know from Rob de Rubis's work, the therapeutic alliance is a two-way process. And there's some fantastic experimental psychopathology to be done there. The work on sudden gains, for example, some real good breakthroughs happening in this sense. And it's very exciting, but it's not about discarding the processes. It's about the fact that we were already doing this, Stefan. This is not new. And in many ways, I kind of think that this sort of pick and mix version of it that says, well, let's see what survived in the literature is very dangerous, because it runs the risk of being like Facebook or Twitter, where we actually develop our understanding because lots of people said it. And so we all know that vaccination gives Bill Gates control of you because hundreds of people say it, or hundreds of studies say it. Now, I think our field has been radically altered by a small number of individuals, and you could give Wolpe, you could give Freud, and there's a whole range of people, many of whom were disbelieved for many years. So
if I could,
yeah.
Thank you for clarifying that. So that clarifies it. So by no means did we imply that therapeutic alliance is not crucial and important. In fact, that is a central part of what we would consider in PBT. That's the entire social component. The level is actually a critical piece. So a lot of the processes that are going on in treatment are playing out in the therapy session. It is for that reason, we would argue, by the way, that computerized, fully sort of more or less automated therapy type intervention approach is not going to be overly fruitful in the long run. You can boil it down to simple strategies to try this and try that, but you're not moving the person toward the desirable goal. So if I could just say again, thank you, Jacques, for your just a few words to everybody. If I could just very briefly say that, Jacques, thanks so much for your kind words. I do agree with your statement about process-based CBT versus process-based therapy. We were discussing that in great length, Steve and I, and we initially called it process-based CBT. We thought we don't want to just limit ourselves to within this confine of CBT. CBT has become very broad. Within our CBT community, we feel like even Tim Beck said at some point, the term CBT has stretched too far. And perhaps we should call it just therapy at some point. And maybe we were not there yet. And perhaps there are too many divergent opinions about what therapy is. But rest assured, the term CBT has become so broad that it's not overly meaningful, because it's much more than just C and the B associated with. So, just briefly to Paul again. I respectfully disagree with your judgment about the evolutionary science idea. Richard Dawkins' Blind Watchmaker is a really old book. I recommend that you instead David Sloan Wilson's Darwin's Cathedral or other work. He has been a co-author on many of our articles that boils down to the core principles of evolutionary science that is not debatable. I think even the most how shall I say opinionated scholar in the field would agree that adaptation in real life requires flexibility. That means variation, selection, retention, sticking to what seems to work, and then fitting it to the context. This is not new at all. This is what also Darwin said. The problem is that psychology has been adopting it, has been sort of in a. Darwin has become had a very bad rep among psychologists because we are thinking in terms of social Darwinism and features of humans that make them more adapted than others. That's nonsensical. The evolutionary principle is a fact of life, and that applies to humans. If I could just now say a few words about Bruce, I completely agree with that. Therapeutic alliance is essential, and basically you're supporting my case that these kind of strategies are old. The strategies are out there. We don't need to reinvent them. We don't need to find actually a lot more new ones. We have what it takes to treat people adequately. What is required is to actually fit them to the individual, to the given person sitting in front of us in the office. That's what and PBT is an approach, and perhaps it's not the ideal approach, but we are trying to provide broad guidelines for clinicians to take on a very broad lens and then individualize these strategies to the given client. So, and I'm stopping here now.
But that's a great place for me to comment, Stefan, because I think that's a important observation to make, that this is a general set of strategies that might be used for particular patients. Now, here's a question I have. So I'm convinced anyway, and I think many others are, that a coherent explanation for the disorder and a means to overcome one's difficulties with some actions, very specific therapeutic actions, and CBT has been really good in this, is really a vital part of psychotherapy. So the patient's understanding what's wrong with me and what do I have to do to get better. So in your framework, how does that work? How does the therapist communicate with the patient about the patient's particular difficulties?
So we see therapy in the process, that's why we emphasize process so much, as really a dynamic change. Goals change along the way. Sometimes they come into therapy, don't even know where they want to go. This is for that reason, these complex networks allow us to visualize that. And it's not a simplistic functional analysis, by the way. It's sort of bringing in as much information as we can have, and we develop that with a client. So in other words, it is worked out in the therapeutic context, and often the goalposts change because because things are moving along. Therapy is a time-dependent variable. It is impossible to say, "Oh, now you reached the goal and now you're good." And the problem, though, is that's how we train our clinicians today. We in a simplistic way. No, not us. Probably not you.
That's really how you do it, but that's not how I do it.
Look at guidelines that are published in major journals, and how this is how clinicians ought to be trained.
American journals.
I think that the problem is that we need to be cognizant of the fact that this is treating a client is more than just reducing symptoms, than just fixing people. Therapy is considerably more complex than that.
But Stefan, we've been saying this. Critics of CBT have been saying this for decades.
And we've been embracing it now. Yes.
Yeah.
We've been embracing
what you just said, many of us have been saying over and over to you.
Now we're listening, Bruce.
And Stefan, an awful lot of cognitive behavior therapists have been doing it for an awful long time. And in fact, you and some of your colleagues have discovered it quite late. Can I just take you back to the evolutionary thing? Because essentially, what's missing here is learning. I mean, you must have done some training in learning theory. So it seems to me you're more Lysenko than learning. And I don't really understand the idea of evolution of an individual organism, because that's Lysenko. I don't think we want to go Lysenko.
Adaptation is learning is leading to adaptation.
Yeah, but why not call it learning? We know a lot about learning, and
learning is so
learned
broad
learning
that
theory.
you don't have to put it in a dimension of this EAM. This is learning. This is moving forward. Learning is too broad in order to confine it to this.
But my patients can learn. They actually struggle with the idea they're going to evolve. I mean, what are we going to do? Genetic engineering? I mean, Jesus, we should be very careful about the language we use.
May I intervene at this point? Because I would like to bring the discussion to one aspect that has been mentioned in some of your comments. And this is training of young psychotherapists, young people who want to become excellent psychotherapists. And when we prepared this discussion, we thought about, well, we think there should be an umbrella theory about psychotherapy or some framework, and maybe process-based is one idea, or Bruce, you also have suggested other models. But the reality of training young psychotherapists over the world is very different from that. This is very tradition-focused and it remains most of the parts of the trainings in the framework of one tradition. So, which means we leave a lot of other experience out from these trainings. And therefore, we suggested that topic. What is the common ground? Do we need a common ground? Wouldn't it be beneficial to think about some common ground of some umbrella theory, some umbrella approaches that every psychotherapist should know about and should be able to use in his or her daily practice? So I just wanted to bring our attention a little bit back to the discussion.
Could I say that I'm director of a course that trains clinical psychologists, and we don't train in a single approach. We do, of course, help people to become proficient at cognitive behavior therapy and systemic family therapy, for example. But actually, what we're training them to be are essentially people who blend clinical science and clinical art in the service of helping people. And that's what, in my view, clinical psychology is. This is the European Association of Clinical Psychology. And I think it's really important to be aware that it's also evolving in the sense that it changes, not in the sense that its genetic material has shifted. And I think that's really important. The school's approach is very problematic and is very rigid, and was one of the mistakes that was made really pre-1960, I think, where essentially only the guru could tell you what happened, and they either had to die or a splinter group had to form. Whereas now we're in a very different situation as applied scientists.
But Paul, wouldn't you agree that this is still the reality of trainings?
Oh, well, it might well be in your department, Winfried. I don't know.
That's not fair.
but no, I think the reality is that we teach people that the clinical science and clinical art blend is very important. When we select people, we're trying to select people who are decent human beings, who have the ability to empathize and to work alongside people and to collaborate with them and so on. I kind of think, that there's something much more subtle going on as opposed to a particular school or indeed process-based or even formulation-based, because therapy is not the only thing that we necessarily do. We also issues around prevention, public health, and so on. So it's much broader than that, in my view.
Hey, Jacques, we haven't heard from you much. I would really be interested in your perspective about how well psychodynamic theory and treatment coincides with Stefan's model, because I see some aspects of that which psychodynamic people have been talking about for some time.
Yeah, I was not so much interested in trying to find the common ground, but more about distinguishing between what he's describing and what we do. So, but I think one of the main interesting thing about psychodynamic psychotherapy are things that Paul mentioned, and you mentioned, the relationship. So there's no need for me to emphasize that more. We all care about the relationship. I think we take a much more active role in terms of how to handle the relationship and how to say something about it. I rarely see CBT people doing that. I think another very, very important aspect for me is this idea of collective emotional experience. And I think that's something that all of us do. There's different names, and I would have wished to see it in your list. But as I said, I think part of the problem for me was that Stefan list is really a CBT list. It didn't really speak to the broad, didn't speak to humanistic psychologists too much or too dynamic. I have a question for you, Paul, by the way. I'm a big believer in formulation. In our case, that's dynamic formulation. But I don't see that as a mechanism of change.
Oh, I'm not suggesting formulation is the mechanism of change. It's the way in which the patient adopts the formulation. Essentially, it's people discovering how the world really works. People become stuck. The formulation is a characterization of the process that are involved, in meaning that they can't move on, that they're stuck in a particular way of reacting. And then
what is the mechanism? So what is
the mechanism is sharing with people an alternative, less negative way of viewing the world, and then having them actively test that out. That's also drawn from a combination of our understanding of these processes, the kind of thing that Stefan's talking about in process-oriented, but also drawing on their experience and actually helping them assimilate that. And that's a large part of what the therapist is actually doing, and so on. So I think it's the adoption of an alternative, less rigid, less negative way of viewing the world, and then actively adopting that, trying that out with the support of the therapist.
Right. So I think there is a big role to practice that you're speaking about, that some of my people in my tribe have forgotten about it, but we have been speaking about it very intensively, because the application of skill is crucial and the working through is crucial. Mm-hmm. And that also wasn't been clear. I mean, I think most behaviorists do that, but I don't know how it impacts in your model. Bruce, you had something in mind that you wanted me to say. I welcome you to say it yourself.
Well, yeah, I mean, I the personalization. Take Milan's triangle, okay? That's a general triangle, but when the psychodynamic therapist applies that, every patient has different defenses used in different way. And we could say that's maladaptive behavior. And what we're giving is an alternative to try out collaboratively. I mean, I see so many parallels. Paul, I like the idea that we're learning, the patient is learning something new. And the learning theory really has a lot to tell us about how to initiate that, how to consolidate it, how to make it reinforcing. Now, we do it in so many different ways. I mean, you're going to do it different in CBT than Jacques does it in dynamic therapy. But the patient is learning something new and they find out that it's reinforcing, and the therapist and the patient collaborate around that learning and consolidation. I don't think we have to make it too much more complex than that.
Yeah.
If I could I follow up with a question that came up when Jacques spoke. What is missing in our approach? Or in other words, how could it be expanded to accommodate a more psychodynamic approach? I would be honestly curious.
We just gave you some example of strategies that we tend to use that you don't mention.
Okay.
That's one thing. So this could be the relationship, but it's also interpreting the relationship, listening, and reacting to what you listen. I mean, I think all of us do that, but it's not. I didn't see that.
Yes. Okay.
So that's a
we have it. We have it sort of hidden in the social dimension of So, but okay.
Let's give you some ideas.
Yeah.
Stefan, I think the matrix of your different dimensions for the patient is potentially a useful one. What's missing for me, first of all, when you say what could we do to expand it, my advice was to make it simpler. Okay. It's much too complex as it is. So don't expand it, make it simpler. But what's missing for me is, and maybe it's there, and I admit having not read this carefully, is how that works out in the course of therapy. And how does one apply that model and learn to apply it in a way that's simple enough for both the therapist and the patient to collaborate. And simplicity is something I found. When I hear therapists explain what's going on, sometimes it's so damn complex. I have to go back to graduate school to understand it. Patient wants a simple, understandable, direct pathway to learning something new, to use Paul's language. So how did we do that?
I hear you, Bruce, and that's why we, without being overly self-promoting, that's why we wrote Learning PBT. This learning process-based therapy is exactly doing that. It guides people through that process. And we've been doing more workshops than I can count at this point on this issue. And our clinicians, the consistent feedback, by the way, clinicians in our workshops are from all different orientations, typically not the typical CBT folks, but they are more from, often we have psychodynamic folks in there and also third wavy folks. And they're saying that, especially the experienced ones, saying, I do something like that already. But it gives me a broad framework it guides me to know why I'm doing what I'm doing. So and that's what we wanted to do. We wanted to go back to the clinicians who are sort of have this wisdom in how the tailoring, the individualizing the treatment. How do you do that? And that's obviously we wanted to still base it and place it on empirical and evidence. So it can't be anything that seems to work, but it needs to be derived based on evidence. That was our sort of crucial starting point. Nobody has complained that it's too complex, Bruce, throughout this history. So it's and if I could cite my fellow German fellow, my German friend Albert Einstein, everything things should be made as complex as possible, but not more. Should be as simple as possible, but not more. So some things can't be reduced further to. I'm not sure if this model can be further reduced. I would love to see it, but I wouldn't. Yeah. I wouldn't know.
Well, Stefan, I told you I never took a psychology course as an undergraduate, so maybe I need to bone up a little bit. But let me ask you a question. If John Norcrest called you and said, I want you to write a chapter for the Handbook of Psychotherapy Integration, would you say yes, because this is an integrative model?
It's a meta model. I'm not sure if it's an integrative model. I suppose so. It does incorporate. It provides enough room for everybody to play with, as long as you are on evidence, on ground of evidence. So it's integration means a little mixing things together and then making it like something that was not before. This is not what we have in mind, but rather building a broad framework.
Yeah. Well, we could have a long discussion about evidence and what you take as evidence. I would doubt whether all of those strategies are evidence-based in the sense that as they're applied in a particular context, and that's what you're saying. Yes. We're never going to have that kind of evidence. Yes. Paul, you said, there's an art and a science to this. And I heard Daniel Kahneman talk about this. And he said, we want evidence-based procedures. This was a lecture to clinicians. But in the moment-to-moment interaction, that's not evidence-based. What you say at moment X in response to the patient saying Y is never going to be evidence-based in that sense. And that's where, skillful therapists really have an advantage in delivering treatments, because it's not a simple matter of saying, hey, in this matrix, these things are evidence-based. What we do in therapy is a lot more complex than this. And I guess you'd probably agree with the complexity part.
Yeah, I agree with that too, Bruce. Although I must say that what I see happening in the technology today about, replacing therapists with technology is pretty impressive. And, it's very easy to see that 20 or 30 years from now, the computers will be able to do things that... So, I agree, but still, I see things happening that are just amazing.
Can I say something about that, actually? Because, Stefan, you were a bit dubious about computerized-based CBT. I've been involved in the validation of things in the context of stepped care. In other words, sort of rather simpler problems having simpler things. There's also, of course, for a long time been self-help books. And I think the reality is that people do form therapeutic relationships with computer programs and self-help books with the person they imagine behind it, who they see as an authority. And if they've written a book, or if the program has been produced, then the presumption of expertise. And in the interaction, it's fairly clear that therapeutic relationship does form to a degree. And I think for many people, this may well be sufficient, because in the end, all therapy is self-help, facilitated or otherwise, and people can arrive at that in a range of different ways. And the extent to which a medium is trusted, essentially, I think, equates to a therapeutic alliance in a rather strange but interesting way.
So let me add something to this, because I was very interested in this question, and I began asking patients to fill out the questionnaire about their lines before they even saw the therapist. And it's very highly correlated between what they expected of their lines before they saw a therapist and what's happening after that. Yeah, it's also related to outcome.
Well, the alliance in computer assisted therapy like that, Paul, is just as predictive of outcome as it is in face-to-face. The other point I would make is we got to come back to Paul's comment about learning. So you can learn by sitting in a room with a therapist facilitating that learning. But that's not the only way we learn. We read books and learn. We're computer-assisted things. So if you take that learning framework, you really understand how a range of interventions could be effective.
So if I could just say, moving toward adaptation is learning, right? First of all, so it's not at all inconsistent. It's actually, in a way, a different word for saying the same thing, or different phrase. So computerized or also e-health, digital health, clearly have a role, and I'm also moving pretty far into that, because it's also, especially within for PBT, it can be incorporated. The goal of why we do that is to not only to find easy ways to deliver it and cost-effective ways to deliver treatment, etc. And in order to move some people toward a betterment in their condition. All of this is fine if that's your goal, but I think our ultimate goal, and I wonder if you agree with that, is to treat everybody in the best possible way. And if we use that as our goalpost, then sitting in front of a computer is just not going to cut it. I firmly believe that. Maybe for some, what you mentioned, Paul, for some minor issues in a step care, to have some guidance in very, very circumscribed issues, perhaps for some. But in replacing therapy with a computer, we target the symptoms, we target the specific problems. We're not dealing with the individual in the way we could.
Stefan, there's two things. That's an empirical question, and I think you'll find that actually there's already some answers which say you may be wrong. The other thing is that it's fine if you're doing private practice with rich clients, but the reality is there's a world out there that's suffering in a really very major way. And you ask your friend Stephen Hayes about this. He talks a great deal about suffering. The reality is we need to help people deal with their mental health. The mental health issues or psychological issues and problems.
Not disagree.
And therefore, the idea that only that Bruce or myself or Winfried are the only people who can do it, I think are not there. And I do think if we assume, as I do, that the key processes can be dealt with by self-help, and that a therapist is a very efficient way of doing that, if we can distill that in the way that you mentioned Gordon Paul did for specific phobias, you can distill that, then perhaps we can make ourselves redundant from a large range of problems. And I think that's a worthy goal at all kinds of levels, in my view.
Yeah, these are two different issues. Sorry, this is not. We have a mission to improve suffering in the world, period. And there are, and you can do it in different ways. The theoretical goal that PBT is based on is to individualize treatment in such a way that you achieve optimal outcome.
But Stefan, we've been doing that for years. And the question is whether it's possible to distill that.
We have not, Paul. We have not. We've been grouping people together in ridiculous, arbitrary diagnostic categories and saying somebody has a depression. Or
honestly, speak for yourself.
You've been studying OCD. You haven't been.
I've studied obsessional problems.
No, I know, but you're grouping people based on surface symptoms.
I think you need to read my work, Stefan. I know you've accused me of not reading yours, but I do think you. And I mean, let me say the object lesson. Joe Woolpe was the object lesson in this, because Joe Woolpe, 58, is publishing 80 sessions of Jacobsonian relaxation, 80 sessions of systematic desensitization, right? And you could never distill that, could you, down to one session, except Lazio and Erst has done exactly that. And it's pretty clear now that you can do the same thing on the basis of computerized program. So these things evolve in the sense that the people doing the research learn from these things, and we learn to do things better and better, more and more efficiently. And that's been true of panic, it's been true of OCD, specific phobias, and so on. And we just need to get better at it. And the idea that the
effect size are decreasing over the years, you know that.
Sorry?
Pim and others showed that the effect sizes are decreasing over the years.
That was depression specifically.
As an example, yeah.
Well, it seems to be the only example. Depression never got solved. I mean, the big problem with depression, I blame it on the lovely Tim Beck, who wrote in 1979, wrote a book that could not be improved on in 1979. And, God bless him. He was the most amazing guy. But he was so far ahead of his time that it was really hard to improve on that. And that actually blighted the field. He also helped the field. I'm really not criticizing Tim. But, there's the advances that we have made. And if you put Pim Kuipers on specific phobias And I think you will find that over the last couple of decades, things have got a bit better. And then we could do a couple of other examples, but let's not.
Well, okay. May I interrupt at this point? Because we also have some questions of the audience. I think it would be nice to allow them, and I hope you agree. So there is one question whether in-session contact processes involving both client and therapist are also an issue in PBT. And this brings me to a little notion, we might allow that I added. What is a good model? What is a good framework? And I wouldn't say this is a good framework is something that includes everything that should be included now, but that a good framework is something that can be adapted to recommendations of Jacques Barber, for example, or to new developments, to new scientific challenges. So the question is your model flexible enough to include something like the interaction between therapist and patient, not only the focus on the client's problems?
In fact, I would argue not only the idea of showing healthy variation, flexibility, selection, retention in a given context is also the process that a therapist should follow in order to approach a client's problems. A therapist should never just stick to his or her favorite technique and approach and keep pushing and pushing no matter where it goes. So that this context dependent approach is not just on the level of the client, obviously, and also and the therapeutic relationship evolves throughout this process. So we see it as a dynamic process that is at any given moment a different one than it was before, and needs to be reassessed in a way.
Wouldn't your concept of dynamic emotional coping fit to this question as well?
Dynamic emotional coping. I need a little bit more data on more to that.
Coping with emotions in the interaction between two people.
Yes. So we would in PBT we often use, so there are lots of some of the ACT strategies, so to speak, come into play as well, but as well as CBT strategies. We use any strategies that seem to work. So we use the therapeutic relationship itself as a ground for trying out certain issues for the client. Absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, all I would say is that we need testable theories, and that's how we'll go forward. And there are some theories which are easier to understand than others. And again, Tim Beck, finest formulator of theories in my lifetime, I believe, and so on. I'm not sure I'd put relational frame theory, Stephen Hayes stuff, in the same category because I still don't understand it. So
neither do I.
Neither does he, I think. But,
neither do I.
But the development of good theories, which could be transdiagnostic processes. I'm very interested at the moment in betrayal, and it's something I'm doing quite a lot of work on. And that's obviously, that's it's an event, and then there's how people react to it, and we got some quite nice theories which do draw a little bit on things of other people in the room as well. And I think that's really interesting, and developing testable theories, which you then knock down. Wolpe's reciprocal inhibition went. Gordon Paul thoroughly demolished it in a really good way. And I kind of think that's the model. And there's a rather nice thing about science proceeds in stages. In the first stage, we know nothing and believe that we know everything. In the second stage, we know nothing and believe we know nothing. There are no further stages, and it's like that is definitely true for us at the moment. And if we remember that, then that will allow us to make progress, piece at a time. But the theory is super important, basically.
Well, that raises the question of what's testable in this model.
Yeah.
I would say this. My prediction is that those therapists you train in this model are not going to become more effective than they are now. we come back to this question of access to treatment. And I think these energies we spend discussing new treatments, new meta treatments, better spent in trying to increase access to care, because we know what we do is remarkably effective. We just need to treat more people. More people need our services. So,
but then also the question is, how do we treat them, right? I mean, this is also linked. My starting out point was treatment protocols are not the right way of doing that, because we need to reduce them down to components, smaller blocks that we can put them together with. That's the entire starting out point. Would you agree with that or not disagree, Bruce?
Well, I would probably agree with you that just having a manual for a particular problem without understanding the conceptualization for this particular patient is problematic. That's nothing new. And, in defense of CBT, they've said that all along. This is a general model for this particular syndrome or collection of issues. And you have to apply it for this particular patient and understand their learning history and what's adaptive.
Yet so we have a library of treatment protocols. That's what we have. That's what we have. Thousands of books.
But if you look at worldwide, then I kind of think you need to think slightly differently. And again, we got Winfried on the call. I mean, the development of narrative therapy, for example, for PTSD in areas of conflict and so on, has been an amazing thing. And and my limited understanding of that is it's not a little piece. It's actually something rather interesting and coherent and so on. It involves conceptualization, helps people see the world differently. I'm very wedded to this idea that it's about helping people discover how the world really works. So
we are approaching the end of our discussion. What about if everybody makes a final closing remark and maybe on focusing on the question, how can we improve treatments? Bruce said we just have to disseminate it, but I think it's still a little bit disappointing to say we are at the top level of efficiency. I don't think so. I think there's still room for improvement, and how can we achieve that? So this is one question. But the second one, I think, which is also important, is how can we improve trainings of psychotherapists? Either making them more economic or making them more effective. I think this is, and maybe Stefan's model is helpful for that, maybe Bruce's model is helpful for that, but I would like to hear some comments of you on how can we improve the situation in training, but also, of course, at the end, for effectivity of our treatment.
Yeah, well, Winfried, I'm very interested in that question, because I think we can, and these are testable hypotheses, determine what characterizes effective therapists. We know quite a bit about that now. It's a sophisticated set of interpersonal skills in delivering particular treatments. So this isn't instead of, this is how it's applied, okay? And we should use what we know about experts. Experts use deliberate practice. There's a whole literature on that. And I think we need to train our therapists, regardless of what model they adopt, to do this effectively. And the criterion is, do they get good outcomes with their patients? For me, I don't care what treatment protocol is used, whether it's CBT, dynamic, or Stefan's protocol. If the therapist in his or her practice achieve commendable outcomes, that's an empirical question. And I think we should think about training the therapist to deliver what they do effectively, not have these debates about which treatment is the most effective.
So I wonder how much training is really making a difference in this regard. So one of the big questions for me is, so we know a lot about training, but I'm not sure that we have shown that the therapist is born or is trainable. And I think that's a very important question regarding training.
Thank you, Jacques. Paul, any comment from your side?
Yes, my emphasis for many years has been the importance of empirical grounding, which is different to evidence-based. It's empirical grounding that therapists need to be trained and operating permanently within a self-correcting system, which, as far as I'm concerned, means things like the evaluation of their own individual outcomes. The use of single-case experimental designs is really, really important here. And it's the reason that people don't do that is because it's disappointing. You know, and it's easier to think, oh, well, the patient's results are not improving, but that's because the measures are useless, not because I'm useless. And then at service level as well, and you know, the David Clarke's development of IAPT, the Improving Access Psychological Therapy System, where you've got 95% data completeness in a socialized healthcare system, where they publish the individual service results, and the services pay attention to these and then self-correct, so that, for example, they provide additional supervision, they shift the training, they change training, they can work out that for particular problems that they're doing rather less well or better, and so on. It's a self-correcting system. So these are all important. That's in terms of sustaining it, but the empirical grounding and the development of good experimental psychopathology is what will also help us improve things further, because, as you say, Winfried, we have a long way to go, and we are the people on this call. I invite you all to participate in that enterprise to take us further.
If I could just add one more sentence. I know we're out of time, but I think we have considerably more agreement than disagreement, I observe. And what we've been discussing is also the goal of treatment. There's a whole new discussion on that, I think. And I think this goes back to where we're starting out from, because we need to rethink the definition of a goal is not reducing symptoms in a client and reducing clinical severity rating on a particular scale. This cannot be the goal. Yet that's how we do treat the research. That's how we do it. We're doing this kind of RCT work. I'm as guilty as anybody. Most of my life I've been doing these RCT trials. Okay, and I've come to the realization this is not the way forward. We need to rethink the way we do. We have a lot to offer as in our field. We really have the strategies. Compare that to most of the most effective pharmacotherapy. We really know how to deal with people, but we are not assertive enough to say let us take over the steering wheel and let's get rid of this syndrome idea, this latent disease idea, this confinement. I know you've been there already, some of you, Bruce and Jacques. Not everybody is on the same page with that, and I think we need to rethink clinical science research in a fundamental way.
Okay, I think this gave us a great frame for the whole discussion. So I would like to finish here and hand over to Martha to say some closing remarks.
Thank you very much, everyone here, and also those at home. It's been fascinating and also very enjoyable how you were politely debating with each other and agreeing to disagree and also agreeing. Please watch a space for our next webinar, which we are planning for February and then May. And then in November 2020, we can all meet at the EACLIPT conference in Warsaw. So thank you very much. Good night and see you soon.